A newly appointed police chief arrives at his station in civilian clothes, wanting to see how his officers behave when they believe no one important is watching. However, when a white officer insults him and spits in his face, mistaking him for someone insignificant, the entire room is about to witness a stunning revelation that will shock everyone present. On a humid Tuesday morning in August, Richard Nelson, recently named as police chief, exited his vehicle in the center of Blue Ridge, a small town nestled in the hills of North Carolina. Wearing an ordinary plaid shirt, faded jeans and worn sneakers, he appeared nothing like someone who had dedicated 20 years to advancing through law enforcement ranks. This was precisely what he intended. Richard valued seeing situations as they genuinely were, not through the sanitized perspective of formal meetings or prepared greetings. As a black man assuming a leadership position in a precinct surrounded by rumors of wrongdoing, he wished to view the department without filters. What better method than to remain inconspicuous? The station's parking area was active with officers arriving and departing. Richard surveyed the scene, observing the relaxed conversations and occasional looks in his direction. Nobody appeared to know who he was, which wasn't surprising. His appointment had been made public only recently, and he had decided against announcing his arrival until the formal inspection scheduled for later that morning. He pulled down his baseball cap and breathed deeply. The burden of his purpose to eliminate the corruption growing within the department weighed heavily upon him. He was familiar with opposition, but he understood this position would challenge him in unprecedented ways. As he neared the building, soft laughter drifted through the air. Richard entered the precinct through a side door, unnoticed amid the buzz of informal conversation and telephone rings. The tile floors gleamed under bright fluorescent lighting, and the scent of old coffee lingered in the atmosphere. He moved deliberately, watching the interactions around him. Clusters of officers gathered near workstations, some sharing stories, others examining documents. Nobody gave him much notice until he stopped near the break area. "Hey you!" A harsh voice pierced through the sounds. Richard turned to see a white officer walking toward him. A cocky smile spread across his face. His name tag displayed Officer Daniels. Behind him, several others stood against the wall, observing with curiosity. Richard began to speak, but Daniels wouldn't allow him the opportunity. "Lost, are we? This isn't a homeless shelter," the officer declared, his voice filled with contempt. "You need to take that nonsense elsewhere." Richard stood still, the words hitting him like a blow. He was uncertain whether to identify himself immediately or allow the situation to continue developing. Before he could choose, Daniels moved closer, raising his voice for his audience's benefit. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need people like you loitering around." Laughter broke out from the spectators, and Richard tightened his jaw, his heart racing. He attempted to speak, but Daniels leaned forward, his face very close. Then suddenly, the officer spat directly into Richard's face. Everything seemed to freeze. Richard's breathing caught as the warm saliva ran down his cheek. Around him, the laughter intensified. One officer hit the table, bending over with amusement, while another mumbled something about putting the troublemakers in their place. Richard's thoughts raced. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, but he maintained his calm. He reached into his pocket, retrieving a handkerchief to clean his face. His actions slow and measured. "Is this how you treat everyone who enters these doors?" he asked, his voice composed but strong. Daniel sneered. "Only the ones who don't belong here." The group laughed again, but Richard remained silent. Instead, he turned and walked down the corridor, leaving the officers behind. As he moved toward the precinct's main office, an intercom came alive, summoning all personnel to the briefing room. It was time. The briefing room buzzed with conversation as officers entered, some carrying coffee cups, others chuckling over private jokes. Richard came in through a side entrance, now carrying a folder bearing the precinct's official emblem. He stood just outside view, observing the room fill with recognizable faces, some still amused from the earlier event. At the front of the room, Captain Harris, a heavy-set man with a graying mustache, requested order. "All right, settle down, everyone. We have an important introduction today." The officers grew quiet, their interest aroused. Daniels leaned against the wall, his arms folded, a smug look still on his face. The man was clearly enjoying his morning. Captain Harris cleared his throat. "As most of you are aware, Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been awaiting his replacement, and I'm happy to present our new leader, a man with an outstanding record and a vision for this department." Richard stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate. The room became motionless as he approached the podium, his presence demanding attention. He placed the folder on the stand and slowly examined the room. His composed manner only intensified the tension. Daniel's smirk disappeared. The color left his face as understanding struck. The other officers exchanged nervous looks, some whispering, others staring at Richard with wide eyes. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice stable. "My name is Richard Nelson. Starting today, I'm your new chief of police." The silence was overwhelming. Daniel's face became deep red, his confidence vanishing. Richard's gaze found him, lingering for a moment longer than needed before moving across the rest of the room. "When I arrived this morning," Richard continued, "I came in regular clothes because I wanted to see the department through an honest perspective. What I observed was revealing." A whisper moved through the crowd, but Richard lifted a hand to quiet it. "In my short time here," Richard continued, "I've already witnessed behaviors that are not just unprofessional, but completely unacceptable. Let me be clear. The culture that has been permitted to grow here ends today." The room stayed eerily silent, the impact of his words settling in. Daniels moved uncomfortably, his eyes looking toward the floor. Richard took a step nearer to the podium's edge, his tone sharp but controlled. "Respect is not a choice. It's the basis of what we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail. Not just each other, but the community we serve." He allowed the silence to continue for a moment, watching the officers fidget under his stare. "This morning, some of you laughed at what you believed was just another helpless man being humiliated. But let me remind you, everyone who enters those doors deserves respect, whether they're wearing a badge or not." His words sliced through the room like a knife. No one dared to move. Richard let the silence persist, his stare unwavering. The tension in the room was tangible, each officer keenly aware of the weight of his words. Daniels shifted again, his discomfort obvious as sweat beads appeared on his forehead. But Richard wasn't finished. "I understand that change is challenging," he said, his voice steady but filled with authority. "But let me be clear. There will be no tolerance for behavior that disrespects the dignity of any individual, whether they are a colleague, a civilian, or anyone else." He stepped down from the podium, walking slowly toward the officers. His presence was commanding, yet his tone carried controlled intensity. "Officer Daniels," Richard said, stopping just a few feet away from the man. Daniels jumped, his earlier bravado completely gone. "You," Richard continued, meeting his eyes, "represent everything that's wrong in this department. When you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the badge, the oath, and the community we promised to protect." Daniel stuttered. "Chief, I didn't know." "That's exactly the issue," Richard interrupted, his voice sharp. "You didn't care to know. You didn't pause to think before you acted because you assumed that man standing before you didn't matter. And that assumption is why this department has lost the trust of the people it serves." The room remained silent, every officer frozen in place. Richard turned his attention to the rest of the group. What I witnessed wasn't just one man's error. It was a culture. A culture where bullying and prejudice are not only tolerated but encouraged. And that stops now. He stepped back toward the podium, his voice rising slightly. "I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just in the streets, but within the walls of departments like this one. Change isn't simple, and it won't happen overnight, but I promise you this. As long as I'm chief, This precinct will operate with integrity, respect, and accountability." Richard paused, letting his words sink in. Then, with a slight nod toward Captain Harris, he concluded, "Effective immediately. Officer Daniels is suspended pending an internal investigation. And for those of you who think this is just a minor punishment, think again. This is the first of many changes." Gasps spread through the room. Daniel's face turned crimson, his jaw clenching as he avoided the stares of his colleagues. Richard, unaffected, stood tall. "This isn't about punishment," he said firmly. "It's about establishing a standard. If you're not willing to meet it, this isn't the place for you." He glanced around the room one final time, his eyes meeting each officer's. "If you're ready to do better, to be better, then we'll move forward together. But know this, I will hold you accountable every step of the way." The meeting ended with heavy silence, officers shuffling out of the room without their usual conversation. Richard remained at the podium for a moment, watching as Daniel stormed out, his face showing embarrassment and anger. The other officers avoided eye contact, their expressions ranging from guilt to quiet reflection. Back in his office, Richard sat down at his desk, exhaling deeply. He knew this was just the beginning. Years of established attitudes wouldn't change overnight, and for some they might never change at all. But he hadn't come to Blue Ridge to make friends. He came to make a difference. The phone on his desk rang. It was Captain Harris. "Chief, I wanted to say, you handled that better than most would have," Harris said, his voice hesitant. "Thanks, Captain," Richard replied. "But the real work starts now. I need a complete review of Daniel's history on my desk by tomorrow. Complaints, incident reports, everything." "You've got it," Harris said before hesitating. "And Chief, I think you affected a few of them today in a positive way." Richard hung up, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction before diving into the pile of paperwork in front of him. Over the following weeks, the precinct was a different place. Officers who once laughed at Daniel's behavior now avoided him entirely, whispers of his suspension spreading through the department. Richard made it a point to walk the halls regularly, greeting everyone he passed, his presence a constant reminder of his leadership. Some officers embraced the change. Officer Reyes, a younger recruit, approached Richard one day, admitting that she'd been complicit in the toxic culture out of fear of retaliation. "I want to do better, Chief," she said sincerely. "That's all I ask," Richard replied, his voice kind but firm. "It starts with you." But not everyone was willing to change. Daniels filed an appeal against his suspension, claiming unfair treatment. Richard held his ground, standing firm in his belief that accountability wasn't optional. The department's review uncovered a series of previous complaints against Daniels, ranging from excessive force to inappropriate comments. His appeal was denied, and Richard made it clear that the days of hiding misconduct were over. Despite the progress, Richard knew the road ahead would be long. Discussions about implicit bias and community relations were met with mixed reactions, but he remained determined. Each small victory, a recruit speaking up, an officer reconsidering their approach, was a step toward something greater. One morning, Richard attended a community event where he met a young boy who shyly approached him. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "I am," Richard said with a smile. "My dad says the police don't care about us," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard crouched down to meet his gaze. "I can't change the past, but I promise we're working to do better," he said gently. "And if you ever need help, you come find me, okay?" The boy nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. It was moments like this that reminded Richard why he had taken the job in the first place. By the end of his first year, the precinct was far from perfect, but it was undeniably different. Officers who couldn't adapt were gone, replaced by recruits who shared Richard's vision for a fair and respectful department. The community, once skeptical, began to see signs of change, a renewed effort to build trust and bridge divides. Richard stood in the precinct's main hallway one evening, watching as officers filed out after their shifts. The laughter and camaraderie felt different now. Not at someone's expense, but genuine and inclusive. He knew there would always be challenges ahead, but for the first time he felt hopeful. Change was never easy, but it was worth every fight. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more emotional, dramatic, and unexpected tales. And thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.